Welcome back to 1834. LaBourdonnais is winning 3 games to 2 and it's the first to win 5 that will take this 6th match. Today's guest commentator is... Okay then, LaBourdonnais has the white pieces once more. McDonnell has only had them once so far in this 6th match. There may be a very good explanation for that, but I will tell you about it in a later video. For now, LaBourdonnais opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, and now b4, the Evans Gambit. And everybody knows that a gentleman must accept a gambit. P-Dog says that when a fight is inevitable, one must always strike first. Whichever way, McDonnell is a gentleman and a fight is inevitable, so he accepts the gambited pawn. LaBourdonnais continues with c3 and the bishop goes back to a5. P-Dog is starting to explain about the last 1,000 years or so of the history of his people. He seems quite happy, so let's leave him to it. LaBourdonnais takes the time to castle, and now we have d6 from McDonnell letting his light square bishop out. LaBourdonnais sends a pawn into the centre, leading to a pawn exchange on d4, and McDonnell brings his bishop back to b6, lining up against the king on kg1. From here, LaBourdonnais develops his dark square bishop and McDonnell develops his second knight, giving space for castling. We now have e5 from LaBourdonnais threatening the knight. McDonnell simply captures with his pawn, but instead of capturing back, LaBourdonnais pushes straight past to d5 and attacks the knight. We last saw this position in match 5, game number 11. In that game, McDonnell played his knight back to e7 and won after 42 moves. This time he plays his knight out to a5 and threatens the light square bishop. But LaBourdonnais doesn't try to save his light square bishop here. Instead, he uses his dark square bishop to capture the pawn in the centre, which looks weird because he's left this capture on. He's probably thinking if McDonnell does capture it, he's going to bring the queen up to here, give it a check, and after blocking, the queen is going to pick up the knight. But in fact, this position is fine for McDonnell because he gets the opportunity to pick up the pawn in the centre. Whichever way, in this position, after LaBourdonnais captured the pawn, McDonnell found this way too suspicious and he decides to go for safety first and castles. And LaBourdonnais now brings the bishop back to safety on d3 and McDonnell picks up the central pawn anyway. LaBourdonnais now develops his second knight to d2. He's anticipating the pin from McDonnell here. He wants to get the queen out to c2 and leave a defender of this knight that's not the pawn in front of the king. And as anticipated, McDonnell does bring in the bishop with the pin. LaBourdonnais first tries to take it away. Maybe it's going to capture the knight, but McDonnell doesn't do that. He brings it back to h5, and now LaBourdonnais plays queen to c2 as planned. Bishop back to g6 now, offering a bishop exchange, which LaBourdonnais accepts, and f-pawn captures the bishop back. Rook on a to d1, lining up against the queen. McDonnell doesn't like this, so he moves it aside to e8, and LaBourdonnais brings in a second rook to do exactly the same thing. So this time McDonnell brings it out to c6, offering a queen exchange. LaBourdonnais doesn't want to accept this just yet, so he moves aside to b2. This is clearly lining up against the pawn in front of the king, and the king is the only defender, so McDonnell lifts his rook to f7 to help the defence. But notice that this rook is now walking into a potential fork. If the bishop were not here, LaBourdonnais could fork the queen and the rook. So LaBourdonnais backs his bishop off to vacate square for the knight. He's also interposing between the dark square bishop and the f-pawn here, which was looking kind of weak. So what does McDonnell do? Does he move the queen or the rook? No, he jumps the knight into f4. What's he doing? Well, if LaBourdonnais goes for the fork, it's immediate checkmate here, defended by the knight. So what does LaBourdonnais do instead? He brings his knight up to e4 to block the checkmate. Now, maybe a rook on a to f8 to get a second rook into the game would be nice, but instead McDonnell goes for a knight sacrifice. But P-Dog says that if you capture the black knight, then the white knight is going to be captured. It is obvious. So LaBourdonnais doesn't go for this. He's being checked, so he's going to have to move the king. He brings it up to h2, and now the knight is in danger. Perhaps McDonnell should bring it back to f4 where it's safe, but instead he decides to sacrifice his rook. Now, P-Dog says, don't be offended, but this is not such a special military operation. Perhaps bringing the knight back first would have been a much better idea. You've also left the pawn in front of the king undefended, so it's going to be fine to capture this rook. It's absolutely fine. This looks like a massive blunder. So LaBourdonnais captures the rook with a big smile on his face. And as we said, this pawn is undefended, and so is the knight. McDonnell decides to bring the knight back to f4, but it's far too late to save the pawn. McDonnell brings his knight back to try to help defend and attack the bishop, but LaBourdonnais brings his knight over as well and offers a knight exchange instead, which McDonnell accepts. In comes the queen, and this is offering a queen exchange here, and McDonnell is happy to accept this with the bishop recapturing on f6. So let's count the material. Rooks are worth 5 pawns each, bishops and knights are worth 3 each, so LaBourdonnais has 10, 13 and 16 with the pawns. McDonnell has 5, 8, 11, and he's got so many pawns, he's got 5 of them. He's also got 16 points as well, so nominally even, but LaBourdonnais does have a pair of rooks, and with all this open space you will expect them to be a very big advantage. McDonnell could grab the pawn here, but that would allow the rook into e7, which is very nasty, so McDonnell defends first. He plays his rook across to f8 and threatens the bishop. LaBourdonnais here brings his second rook up to d8, and this is a massive blunder by LaBourdonnais. He should be keeping both his rooks on the board. Letting McDonnell take one of them off is evening up the game. P-Dog suspects interference from the CIA, but in the meantime, the bishop captures the pawn here. LaBourdonnais ignores it for now and just goes for the rook exchange. That's check, and the black king recaptures. We now have rook to e7 from LaBourdonnais, which looks very uncomfortable for McDonnell, so he brings his bishop back to d4 and threatens the white bishop. If the bishop captures here, then of course the black king is going to capture the rook, so LaBourdonnais brings his bishop back to g5 and McDonnell pushes h6 to threaten again the bishop. But instead of trying to defend this, LaBourdonnais brings his rook back to e4 and threatens the other bishop, which goes back to g7. Both sides are settling in for a long, drawn-out struggle. P-Dog says this is fine, he will see it through to the very end. As long as it may take, peace will eventually return to the region. In the meantime, LaBourdonnais plays bishop to d8 and threatens this pawn, and actually there's nothing that McDonnell can do to save it. He can't defend with the bishop because it will just get captured by the rook. He can't push the pawn to safety because he'll lose the knight. So McDonnell just decides to bring his knight to a more central position, and LaBourdonnais captures the pawn. We have king to f7, trying to advance to a more central position. Likewise with the white king, we have g5, pushing some pawns, and a4 on the wing from LaBourdonnais. h5 now, continuing to push, as does LaBourdonnais. This is defended by the bishop, so the knight can't capture here. King to f6, continuing the big push, but it is blocking this bishop now. Rook to c4, and the king comes across to e6, letting the bishop through. Rook to c5, threatening this pawn, so the bishop defends, but now the rook comes across to b5 and threatens this pawn, and there's nothing that can be done to save it, so it advances into the valley of death. The pawn on the wing captures, this pawn captures, and now this one can't be saved. LaBourdonnais is quite happy to bide his time. He just plays a waiting move, king to g2. And now we have knight to e5, trying to advance somewhere on the right-hand side here. Maybe he can get the pawns forwards, but of course the bishop is going to capture this pawn. McDonnell has managed to form a bridge using the knight. He's now able to bring the king even further forward to f5. LaBourdonnais brings his bishop back to stop him coming any further forward. From here, McDonnell is going to just move the bishop backwards and forwards between e7 and f6, waiting for something to happen. So he starts out, bishop to e7, king across to f2, and now bishop to f6. Bishop down to d2, letting the king up here to the e3 square, and McDonnell just keeps moving his bishop backwards and forwards. King to e3 as anticipated, and bishop back to f6. Bishop to e1 now. He wants to keep an eye on the wing here should the pawns advance. McDonnell does have a passed pawn here, and he pushes it, h4. Bishop to c3 now, and there's all these pins going on, which maybe he can make something of. We have bishop back to g7 now, finally breaking this cycle. King to f2, trying to get in front of the passed pawns, and McDonnell plays bishop to f6. It looks like he's going to cycle between these two squares now. King to g2, and indeed bishop to g4. Bishop to d4 from McDonnell, getting a better angle to come around here to get in front of the pawns, and again bishop to f6. King to h3. He hasn't left this undefended because the knight is actually pinned, but he has he has left this square undefended, so the king advances to f4 and king back to g2. King back up to f5 now, waiting for something better to happen, and the bishop comes across to g1 to help defend in front of the pawns. King to g6 going back, and bishop to h2, threatening the knight here with 2 pieces. The knight jumps out of the way now, perhaps something's starting to happen. Knight to d3, and the rook comes across to d5 to attack it. And P-Dog says that chasing the rook with the knight would continue to be drawish, and in fact he's already drawing up a treaty for both parties to sign, but along comes a donkey named Boris and ruins everything. Knight to f4 with check, the bishop captures, and the pawn captures and breaks up the pawn chain. King to h3, and now McDonnell can't hold everything together. Quite clearly, the king is coming up to g4 and threatening both of these pawns. And so what can McDonnell do to defend this? Well, not very much. He can try to defend with the bishop, but the king is coming up anyway, and now there's a double attack upon the bishop, and McDonnell is in big trouble. He can't just push, because of course the bishop's going to be lost, and it's check, and then you're going to lose the pawn anyway. You could try to drag the bishop back, but of course this pawn is going to be lost and the other one is going to soon follow. So, back in this position, McDonnell decided to fight again another day and resign the game. But there aren't many days left, as LaBourdonnais is now up 4 games to 2 and needs only 1 more to win the match. Join me again next time to see whether McDonnell can find a way back. See you then.